Jalanguru Palangara, Jarananga. Good day, everyone, everywhere. I acknowledge the many beautiful countries we are connecting in from today that weave this vast continent together. And I pay my respects to all our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander elders, past, present, and emerging. And today I give special acknowledgement to the strength, wisdom, and tenacity of our matriarchs who have birthed and raised tens of thousands of generations of our peoples. They are the first mothers of this earth, of Australia. I'm zooming in from Noongar Whadjuk country in Perth, and it is an absolute pleasure to welcome you all to this event from here. It's a beautiful sunny day. So together we can celebrate the launch of our animation, Yajilarra nhingi, mindija warrma. From dreams, let's make it reality. I want to thank all of the amazing people on my team for bringing us together today. We have an incredible lineup of speakers today, and I can't thank them all enough for being a part of this event. Following myself, we will hear from the Minister for Indigenous Australians, the Honourable Ken Wyatt, and the Minister for Women and Foreign Affairs, Senator, the Honourable Marise Payne. Thank you so much for making time in your busy schedules. Joining me for a panel discussion facilitated by the wonderful Patricia Carvelis is Professor Marcia Langton, Fiona Cornforth, Charlee-Sue Frail, and Teela Reid. And the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, Emeritus Professor Rosalind Croucher, will deliver closing remarks. And very soon we will all watch the premiere of our animation, which elevates the voices of our First Nations women and girls who hold the solutions to drive transformative change and make real gender justice and equality in Australia. But before all of that, I would like to say a few words to set the tone for the conversations to follow. For those of you who do not know me, my name is June Oscar. I am nhingi. I am a Bonobo woman from the remote town of Fitzroy Crossing in the central Kimberley in far northwestern Australia, and the first woman to be the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner. In the role's 25-year history, it was certainly time for a woman to take on the mantle of this job, but I never planned to come alone. My drive throughout my term has been to walk through the door and keep it wedged wide open for all our First Nations women and girls to stand with me in recognising and determining the way ahead in how our rights should be realised. For too long, doors have been firmly shut, keeping our women out of the arenas of decision-making, reinforcing our marginalisation and our absence in policy design. This is the case even though I know firsthand how our women are always presenting and present doing the backbone work of society, caring for children, family, and country, and are at the forefront of driving economic and social change, running the initiatives, organisations, and businesses to support the health and well-being of entire communities and regions for the benefit of everyone, our girls and boys, our men and women. I launched the multi-year Wyatt project, meaning women's voices in my Bonobo language, in partnership with the National Indigenous Australians Agency, to make these truths of the diverse strengths and capabilities of our women and girls visible. In December 2020, the landmark Yajilarra report was tabled in the Federal Parliament, following the most extensive engagements with First Nations women and girls as a collective since 1986. My team and I met face to face with over 2,000 women and girls of all ages in every state and territory, from city centres to remote communities. These voices formed the report, which brings a well overdue First Nations gender lens to all interconnected aspects of life, from housing to education and economic empowerment and participation. Yajilarra and its blueprint for change and the momentum it's building around the country as women and girls, organisations and governments pick up the report and use it, comes right when it's needed. We are at a moment in history when Australia and the globe are reckoning with systemic discriminations and far-ranging gender inequalities that perpetuate harm against women and children. Abuse that First Nations women and girls have been the most impacted by for centuries, while also holding the solutions to end it. Outlined throughout the report and the ongoing project work for Yajilarra are hundreds of women and girl-led initiatives and ideas for enhancing whole of societal health and well-being that can simultaneously overcome entrenched discriminations, racism, sexism, and all inequalities. These include, amongst many things, climate justice responses, which centre our women in care for country, and the expansion of cultural programs to sequester carbon, having healthy trauma-free births through the establishment of birthing on country centres in every region of Australia, training the entire public service and institutions in healing-informed practices, and forming mission-orientated financial institutions that can support women to save, design, and invest in projects with social and ecological impact. It is time we respond to our women's voices, because what we know matters in forming the equitable, inclusive, and sustainable structures, policies, and laws that are in the interests of all Australians. But Australia does not have the policy architecture or mechanisms in place to achieve an intersectional gender equality and implement our women and girls' holistic solutions. That is why the major calls for action in Yajilarra are to develop this architecture through establishing a First Nations women and girls advisory body, hosting a national summit, and from that, finalising a national framework for action to achieve First Nations gender justice and equality. The Commonwealth Government has been incredibly supportive of the findings of Yajilarra, but are yet to officially respond to the recommendations. And at this stage, no funding has been allocated to continue this work and to develop a national framework. All of us need to be a part of making sure this report is not for the shelf, and that it has life far beyond its pages. My team and I have been creating resources to help spread the word and support people to engage and use the report. On the Yajilarra website, you can download a supporter toolkit, and this animation is yours to share and spark conversations. Soon, we will also release an implementation framework and a discussion guide to further help translate the substantial findings of Yajilarra into action. So watch this space. Yajilarra sets the tone for a new way ahead. How that way ahead is actualized is up to us all. We all have a part to play in achieving First Nations gender justice and equality and forming the future our women and girls envision today. I know we have it in us all to rise to the challenges and opportunities of this moment in history. Through courage and individual and collective leadership, we can make dreams a reality. So thank you. And it's now my pleasure to invite Minister Wyatt to speak. And thank you, Minister Wyatt, for all your ongoing support.
June, thank you very much. It's great to be with you and to all of those who are online. Are we on? Yeah. Hi, thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the country from wherever you're joining us online throughout Australia, and their continuing connection to land and water and community. I pay my respects to their cultures, country and elders, both past and present, and those emerging. I'm on Ngunnawal country, so I'm coming to you from Canberra. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples on the panel today and those who are listening. I commend the individual efforts of everyone present for your ongoing work in championing the human rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but in particular, our women and our girls. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and girls possess social and cultural strengths which must be drawn on to drive local action as natural leaders and role models. The Morrison government is committed to promoting gender equality and driving the empowerment of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and girls, including our government support and the support of the National Indigenous Australians Agency in enabling Commissioner Oscar and her team with the funding for stages 1 and 2 of her landmark project report under the 4th Action Plan of the National Plan to Reduce Violence Against Women and Their Children, supporting an additional 2,700 places in Indigenous girls' academies by December 2023, which will provide tremendous opportunities for our young women to access educational and career pathways. The national and agreement on closing the gap ensures that gender diversity and disability needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are embedded in all of the actions associated with each of the targets. June, this work is an incredible reflection of the voices of our women, and they go to so many issues that we all have an obligation to address. And I'm happy to advise that the Morrison's government response to Women's Voices report is on track and is expected to be released by the end of the year. I'm leading the response with the support of my colleagues, Minister Payne, who joins me today, along with Ministers for Families and Social Services, the Senator, the Honourable Anne Ruston, and the Attorney General, Senator, the Honourable Michaelia Cash. And in our recent catch-up with you, we recommitted our efforts to ensuring that the elements of your report are addressed in our thinking and in the way forward. The government views your report as a comprehensive and landmark document. Recommendations and findings from the report are already being used widely throughout the Commonwealth to inform policy development, including the next development of the National Plan to End Violence Against Women and Children and the First Nations Action Plan. As the report clearly articulates, if you want effective outcomes, we need to work in partnership. This includes shared decision-making, shared responsibility, and shared accountability. I'd like to publicly thank Commissioner Oscar for the crucial role she has played in ensuring that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women's and girls' voices are heard, and that we as a government are focusing on the areas needed to achieve meaningful and successful progress to the national agreement on closing the gap outcomes, but more importantly, turn our focus to the issues raised by our women and our girls. June, I thank you for that report, and I thank you for the work that you have done.
Thank you, Minister Wyatt. I would now invite Senator Payne to speak about the project. Thank you, Senator Payne.
Thank you very much, June, and thank you very much, Ken, for the opportunity to be here together today. Let me also begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country from all the lands throughout Australia from which people are joining us today, and acknowledge their continuing connection to land, to waters, and to community. Pay my respects to their cultures, their country, and to elders, both past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner, June Oscar. June, for your commitment and your leadership in improving social justice outcomes for First Nations peoples. The Yajilarra report is a very significant piece of work. You have led that. It elevates the voices, particularly of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, to perhaps what could be described as a strong chorus of traditional voices sending very strong messages. And I want to thank all First Nations women who contributed to this important project. Yajilarra is a valuable resource for policymakers, ensuring Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women's voices are included in that policy-making process. For us, particularly eliminating violence against women and children is a national priority for this government. And as you know, we are currently developing the next 10-year national plan to end violence against women and children. A key priority in that is addressing the unacceptable rates of family violence in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. And that is why the government has committed to a dedicated Indigenous action plan to sit under the national plan. And we understand the importance of hearing and incorporating First Nations voices and community-led solutions. To that end, we have established the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Council to inform the development of the next national plan and the Indigenous action plan itself. Commissioner Oscar, amongst others, is playing a special role, an important role as special advisor to the Advisory Council. And as Ken acknowledged, I want to thank you, June, for our recent meeting with Cabinet colleagues on these important issues. I'm very pleased that through the Women's Leadership and Development Program that we have been able to provide funding to support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women in support of improving gender equality in leadership and in economic security. That includes funding to the First Nations Foundation's Indigenous Women's Financial Wellness Strategy, which supports First Nations women to become financially resilient throughout and beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. To ensure that the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are heard in government policy and decision-making processes, we are also funding over 3 years the National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women's Alliance, or NATSWA, known to so many of you. NATSWA is absolutely focused on improving the lives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women by working with governments, with service providers, communities and other stakeholders to understand and to prioritise the safety, health, leadership and economic security of First Nations women. These initiatives, along with the measures announced in the Women's Budget Statement in May, are working to secure safer and more prosperous lives for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. As stated in Yajilarra, lifting women lifts the whole community. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today. It is a privilege to be in attendance at this important event. It does happen, as you might note, in the middle of a parliamentary sitting day. So if I may, on behalf of Minister Wyatt and myself, if I may extend our apologies that we are unable to stay online given those parliamentary commitments, but we wish deliberations and the panel discussion all the best and look forward to continuing to work together.
Thank you, Minister Payne, for your words. So trying to keep in time, and I'm hoping that you would be part of the show of our animation. So it's my pleasure to be able to show you the Yajilarra mindija warrma from Dreams, Let's Make It Reality animation. This animation has been produced with Carbon Creative Proprietary Limited as part of our work to achieve First Nations gender justice and equality. After the animation, I will hand over to Patricia Carvelis for our panel discussion. We hope you enjoy the short 7-minute animation, and we encourage you to visit our website after the event and share amongst friends, families, and your networks.
My true strength is my identity.
Women are the social fabric of our communities.
And the glue that holds everything together.
What makes me strong is the 6 generations of strong women
that taught us about country.
Culture is at the heart for us, for everything we do.
We are sovereign women.
It is time to listen to our voices now.
First Nations women have countless strengths and live diverse and vibrant lives. This is a fundamental truth, too often unrecognised. These strengths are tied right back to our first mothers to walk this continent. The power of our women was set down with our law when the land, waterways, peoples, animals and plants were forming. Our women hold rich knowledge about all existence, knowledge about our interwoven relationships through kinship, about the life and health of plants and animals, of how to govern society and care for country, and how to birth and raise generations of children. Knowledge that we carry and continue to pass on through law, culture, language and ceremony as carers, teachers, leaders, healers and survivors. Our women adapt and thrive while sustaining the oldest living societies on earth.
But sadly, Australia continues to not recognise this truth of the significance of our First Nations women and girls. It all started at colonisation, when a lie was told that this land, our land, belonged to no one. With it came an entirely foreign social, economic and legal system. The structure of our societies, our values and our knowledge systems were all threatened, seen as inferior to Western ways. We were marginalised, undervalued and silenced as they took our land, committed acts of violence such as rape, removed our children and forced us into indentured labour. As women, we were discriminated against on the basis of race, sex and gender. Everything we knew, loved and held close was on the brink of being destroyed forever. But we never gave up. No matter what we face, we rise. We will always rise. Our women remain the backbone of our communities. We hold up society, filling every gap. But still today, where decisions are made about our lives, our voices are not there. Our absence has consequence. We remain invisible to policy and lawmakers. We are not heard, not recognised, and not included, which means the structures they design do not meet our basic rights or help us realise our dreams. In this system, stereotypes fueled by racism, sexism, and all forms of discrimination meet and create inequality and exclusion, impacting us as we move through life. These unequal and discriminating structures block access to resources and services like adequate housing, safe maternal supports, health, and financial security. They limit our choices in education, employment, and where we can live. They cause people to judge us when we are shopping, catching transport, applying for a job, or seeking help. And they put us at ever greater risk of incarceration and our children being taken away. But it doesn't have to be this way. Through our voices, through We Yaniyu Dangani, we can see a future where Australia's structures and society recognise our women, children and families as existing at the centre of intergenerationally healed, healthy and vibrant societies. Because when we centre our women, entire communities benefit.
In this future, the structures and supports are in place for our children to be born surrounded by family and close to community. We grow within our culture, supported by kinship and surrounded by our languages. From our earliest years, we are educated in our knowledges, in balance with Western learnings. Our elders weave lessons of connections to country in classrooms expanding beyond four walls. Paid and unpaid care are considered vital to the functioning of all aspects of society. Our girls and women grow ever more confident, seizing life opportunities and pursuing their dreams in education and work. At every stage of life, we can choose to live on and access our homelands to develop and engage in culture-based institutions and economies. It has never been more urgent to make this future a reality and put the lives of our First Nations women, children and families at the heart of decision-making, where we form the structures that support life for us all.
Together, we can overcome discrimination and achieve equality to build a stronger, fairer and more inclusive nation. It is time for First Nations gender justice and equality. Australia, come on this journey with us. Thank you. To you, Patricia.
Just trying to start my video, everybody. I'm having a few troubles with that. It keeps saying that my host has stopped my video, but I think we can be... Okay, I'm in. Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's event. That animation was amazing to watch and a really powerful way to drive the movement towards First Nations gender justice and equality. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that wherever we are in Australia, we are on the traditional lands of First Nations peoples. I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, upon whose ancestral lands, the lands where I'm joining you from today. And I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, acknowledging them as the First Nation owners and their ongoing connection to land, waterways and culture. And I say this not just because it's become a standard and important process for acknowledgement, but because without a very active acknowledgement and thinking about the land that we have all benefited from the colonisation from as non-Aboriginal people, we cannot truly understand the deep history of this country. I further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country where you're joining us from too. Of course, this one of the wonderful things of the pandemic, many negatives, but one of the positives is the fact that we can all be here around the country together. I want to respect the elders past, present, and again, emerging. My name is Patricia Carvelis, and it is absolutely my pleasure to facilitate today's discussion by an incredibly distinguished panel of speakers, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner June Oscar being, of course, at the centre of all of this. Now, I know many of you know June, but June is, can I say, one of the most formidable leaders in this country. An Aboriginal woman who is fierce about advocating for her people in a way that I think we rarely see like this in this country. June, you are such an incredible voice of reason and clarity, and I think the work that you have done over the last several years has been tremendous, and I want to thank you for that as someone who observes the work that you do pretty closely. She's a proud Bunaba woman from Fitzroy Crossing in Western Australia's Kimberley region. She's a strong advocate for Indigenous Australian languages, social justice, women's issues, and of course, she's worked tirelessly on that issue around fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. June has held a raft of influential positions, including the Kimberley Land Council, the Kimberley Language Resource Centre, and the Kimberley Interpreting Service, and with WA's Liwan project. She began her 5-year term as Australia's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner in 2017. Her work has been incredible. Also on our panel, another incredible, formidable leader, Professor Marcia Langton AO, the granddaughter of an Imam man and a woman who is incredibly proud of her Indigenous heritage from her grandmother who worked in the pastoral industry in southwest and western Queensland. All of you know Professor Langton. She has qualifications in anthropology and geography, and since 2000, she's held this foundation chair of Australian Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne. She's produced a large body of knowledge in the areas of political and legal anthropology, Indigenous agreements and engagement with the minerals industry, and Indigenous culture and art. Professor Langton is a fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences in Australia, a fellow of Trinity College, Melbourne, and an honorary fellow of Emmanuel College at the University of Queensland. In 2016, Professor Langton was honoured as the University of Melbourne's Redmond Barry Distinguished Professor, and in 2017, because she can't help herself but achieve all the time, appointed as the first Associate Provost at the University of Melbourne. Also joining us on the panel is the CEO of the Healing Foundation, Fiona Cornforth. Is a Wanthathi woman descended with family roots in the Torres Strait. She's an extensive background working with Aboriginal people and communities in the Torres Strait as well. She is a master's graduate at the ANU's College of Business and Economics and an associate fellow of Higher Education Academy of the UK. She's worked on intergenerational trauma and has incredible work in this area. Also on our panel, Teela Reid, a proud Wiradjuri and Walwan woman and a lawyer and a storyteller born and raised in Western New South Wales. She's currently a Sydney-based solicitor with experience practicing in land rights, criminal defence and civil litigation. And she's previously held the residence at the Sydney University Law School. Really also, just a little spruik of her Blackfella Book Club, a platform celebrating First Nations ancestors and storytellers, which I personally love watching. It's kind of my following. All of my literature reading is through Teela's recommendations. Charlee-Sue is a Ngemba woman living and working in Canberra. She started her career in Aboriginal community health before moving into campaigning, engagement and policy work. She was the manager of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander engagement for Recognise. That's the constitutional recognition campaign that we kind of predated the Uluru Statement. Charlee-Sue was actually a former Wigayani Udangani advisory committee member and is still actively engaged in that process too. And of course, has been really intimately involved in June's work, working on this really important work that is now before government. And as we heard there from the Minister, a response by the end of the year, which I'm sure June heard very clearly and is very actively waiting for. Now, so welcome to all of our panel members. We have a very, very, very excellent panel this afternoon. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we continue. Please stay with me. I have some excellent questions for my panel. Today's event is being live captioned, and we also have Auslan interpreters. To view the captions, click on the CC closed caption button at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom control panel. Please feel free to use that chat function. However, panel members will not be able to respond to questions during the discussion. There will be a post survey about the event after the event, so you can ask questions in that survey. I'd also like to acknowledge that today's discussion includes topics that might be difficult to hear, upsetting, triggering, could cause distress. Anytime you might feel worried, you're becoming overwhelmed or distressed, please take a break from the webinar. If you feel like it, you can rejoin when you feel better, and but just be really aware of how you're feeling. Sometimes at the most unexpected times, this can happen, of course, to us. You can contact 1-800-RESPECT, and we are putting those contact details on the chat box now. Today's speakers have been working tirelessly to change the outcomes for First Nations women and their families and their communities. We're honoured to be joined by each of them, and I just want to say thank you to June for inviting me to be the person moderating this discussion. It is a privilege to me as a non-Aboriginal woman who is very committed to this area as a journalist to be invited to ask these questions, which I consider the most important questions in our country. I want to start with you actually, June, because you're the perfect person to start with. The Women's Voices report and animation describes how First Nations women are the backbone of society. And we know this instinctively about First Nations women really providing that role in communities, the stability in so many remote and regional communities particularly. Why do you all think, and starting with you, what do you think needs to happen for First Nations women and girls' lives and work to be properly recognised in this country when your voices still remain so marginalised?
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you too for being available to provide your support to all of us on this journey. Look, We Yaniyu Dangani is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to recognise the lives and realise the rights of First Nations women and girls. It is our roadmap. And we must work with governments and other stakeholders as well to put the structures in place so we can fully implement it. And to do this, in the first instance, I'll reiterate our calls to action. We need a First Nations Women and Girls Advisory Body to guide the process. We need a national summit, a point at which we gather for us all to be able to come together with governments and agree to a framework for action going forward that we design. Our women and girls have never had a national gathering like this before, and we need a framework for action that all our women and girls can feel belongs to them, and that is, and that this nation can commit to. The outcome has to be a coherent and dedicated approach to seriously respond to the needs and aspirations of our women and girls. And, these structural supports and mechanisms are absolutely necessary if we are to drive and achieve the intersectional gender equality in this nation. So in terms of the details of what that framework and approach will achieve, We Yaniyu Dangani and the work we continue to do online outlines many actions and initiatives, and we can all begin to act now on what is in the report and what we keep developing through the project work. And I really encourage everyone to go to the website, to the We Yaniyu Dangani website, to download the resources that we do have. So some of the things we need to advocate for changing immediately is to increase social security payments and remove punitive conditions that stigmatizes our women and particularly mothers and carers. Current structures trap women in poverty, and we need to form empowering conditions that gives our women supports and options in life alongside of changing social security arrangements. We need to have access to universal and culturally grounded and secure child care. So women do have the choice to work, care, or have time to fulfill all other responsibilities. And on a practical level, for all employers, we need to make sure workspaces have culturally responsive, gender-sensitive, flexible work options, good cultural leave policies, alongside of training and career development pathways that are designed specifically to meet the needs of our women. So we're looking at our lives in this intersectional way, not in the way that governments often and always look at us through their lens in deficits and a problem to be resolved or a crisis that we need to respond to. And that's disconnected from all of the other issues that we live with each and every day of our lives. So no woman lives her life in a siloed way. We are connected with many other aspects of life, which we hold solutions to. So we have to create the conditions in which our women have choices, because right now they are severely limited, and this undermines and creates further harms. So I might just stop there, Patricia.
Actually beautifully articulated, June, particularly the silo comment you make, which I think is so pertinent about the way often governments too respond. Fiona, I'd like to bring you in if I can. That question I'd love you to respond to as well in relation to what needs to happen to centre the voices of First Nations women and girls, because it seems to me many of the solutions are right before us. It's about taking them.
Oh, absolutely. And where we're headed to is a new norm of widespread recognition that the systems we interact with just do not serve us and must be redesigned by us. And that widespread commitment to us being centred in that redesign. What needs to happen is all structures, systems, sectors and workforces seeing us as critical to that design change and urgently. And look, while discrimination remains the norm in these structures, while it's accepted and while nothing changes in those systems we interact with, we will continue to experience harm and our dreams will continue to be suffocated. Now, Wiyani Utangani points to culture-based institutions and economies because this is where we're strong. Where our first worlds are celebrated, this is what supports us to thrive. Where our careers, vocations, dreams and aspirations are possible in workforces and across systems and sectors and community ventures, these places must be free of harm, free of the perpetuating of further trauma. It's going to take us to be at the heart of decision making, to address what hurts, to address what kills, and to fast track what will support strong spirit, strong culture, and strong people. And this is across all nations. And you know, I'm really grateful this is a human rights issue being led and driven by the Human Rights Commission. I've been so grateful to be alongside this work and a part of this journey. We've got people in there, our team, our own mob and allies working overtime to get this right, to make people more familiar and, you know, and familiar with what's key to better and best, and to bring people on that journey towards that, because it can't wait any longer. So we know what we have to offer the world. We imagine lives without distress. We imagine more joy more often. We know it's possible through us. We show you through the report. And, you know, we've got to stop inviting you now. We've got to implore you, where you don't already, please prioritise responses that tear down barriers like exclusion, our exclusion, and prioritise responses that are grounded in the lived realities and expertise of First Nations women and girls. You can't say you don't know anymore.
Really powerful, Fiona, thank you. Marcia Langton, I want to bring you in to ask you how important you view this report's recommendations to the other process which is going on at the moment, the Indigenous voice process.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, June. for your wonderful work and leadership. Hello to everyone. I'm on Djab country, and just to the south of me is Gunditjmara and Eastern Maar country. So I'm in a very beautiful corner of the world here. The question is a very critical one, Patricia. So our Indigenous Voice Co-Design Group submitted our final report to Minister Wyatt in July. It's not yet publicly available, and I do hope it will be soon. However, a very large part of it is publicly available in our interim report on the National Indigenous Australians Agency website. And you'll see, I can tell you that our principles for the Voice co-design work have not changed. And you'll see in the Yajilarra report that the principles are almost exactly the same. So quite independently of each other, we came up with these principles, our Voice co-design team and June's team. And of course, gender equity is in both of our sets of principles. And we urgently need the principle of gender equity to be implemented across Australia in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. There should be no excuses anymore for appointments made to boards or any governing body without considering gender equity. All of our boards and governing bodies should have an equal number of men and women. I'm particularly impressed with that the principle of inclusion and absolute inclusivity is also there, transparency and accountability as well. And while June's report goes to the issue of identity, and we rather say cultural authority or cultural leadership, they are cut from the same cloth. Our cultural backgrounds are essential to who we are and how we work in the world, and bringing our culture into our workplaces and into the way that we represent our issues is also essential. So that's a very great pleasure for me to see that kind of alignment, because it will emphasise to all Australian governments that these principles turn up again and again and are, well, as you can see, unanimously agreed by people who turn up at these meetings. Now, June's report has recommended a national action plan on advancing the wellbeing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and girls. That's essential work. One hopes that a range of agencies would be involved in developing this national action plan, and all Australian governments, and also recommended at number 2 is a national summit, as June explained, to establish a National Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Women and Girls Advisory Body. There is so much policy work to do, so much legal reform to do. I can't help but say that this is also essential. Empowering women's leadership on the ground, we should all work together on that, and an urgent focus on healing from intergenerational trauma, eradicating racism, and a local and regional focused engagement. We couldn't be in more alignment on these issues as between the Indigenous Voice co-design and the Wiyuyani Uthangani report. So congratulations to June and her team for the intense consultations resulting in recommendations that are in absolute alignment with all that we recommend in the Indigenous Voice report.
Thank you, Marcia. Teela, if I could bring you in, this report is the first time in the nation's history where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander girls have had their voices heard as a collective like this, and it is a powerful piece of work. Teela, how important is it to have First Nations girls and young women involved in the processes of truth-telling and the decision-making process, which has historically, I've got to say, across the board, being held in the hands of men beyond just the Indigenous community? You know, patriarchy, it appears, sees no colour.
Yeah, thanks, Patricia. I'm coming to everyone from the sovereign lands and waters of the Gadigal people, and just south of me is the sovereign lands and waters of the Bidjigal people. Thank you, Aunt June, for this report. When I first saw it, probably about this time last year, I absolutely believe it is one of the most significant reports of this generation. As you have said, you know, First Nations women are indeed the backbone of our communities, but at the same time, we are also the front line of our communities. And I absolutely think, you know, it's interesting your question around truth-telling, Patricia, because there's not a First Nations woman I don't know that is out here every day speaking truth to power. If you walk into a First Nations community, every First Nations woman has a voice, and they are prepared to speak that truth to power at any cost. I think the issue we have in Australia is that these systems of, and what is clearly articulated in June's report is the impact of colonisation and invasion. When she went into these communities, First Nations women were still talking about the impact of these processes and how they have silenced them. And so I absolutely think the first two recommendations in this report need to be, including all of them, but as a priority, the first two recommendations, as Marcia said, this national action plan and a summit that continues to happen year in and year out should be implemented. When we think about the role of First Nations women and their voices, it is indeed so important that those voices are uplifted from the grassroots into the higher houses of power, and that this report should not be seen as well in isolation of something like the Uluru Statement from the Heart and its call for a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. I absolutely think as well, when we think about what has happened over this period of time since systems have been imposed in our communities are quite circular. First Nations women are the matriarchs of our communities. This is very different to the way in which systems of patriarchy have been placed upon us. And there are tangible examples to look at how the impact of these systems have really silenced First Nations women. If you look in the last decade, there was a report as well written by Aunt June there, that highlighted First Nations women are the most highly incarcerated cohort in the last decade. That has increased by almost 130%. That is not because First Nations women are indeed more criminal. It's because of these systems that continually disproportionately impact on us. I think one of the most resounding things that we've kind of had a discussion that's been revealed here today, on the one hand, we can have all of these recommendations, but it is absolutely up to, I can see, you know, 1.2 thousand people here in this Zoom. It is up to each and every one of you to take those recommendations and hold politicians to account in relation to them. They're tangible, they're achievable. And back to your main question, Patricia, which is about truth-telling. I think when it comes to truth-telling, the onus is not always on First Nations women. The onus is absolutely up to the rest of Australia to take accountability for what's happened here. And that means sitting in the discomfort. I could see comments come through when we watched the animation today. And I think, you know, what we forget in Australia is truth-telling is going to be a difficult process. Truth-telling is going to make us feel really uncomfortable, and we have to be prepared to sit in that discomfort, to grow as a nation and to change systems that is ultimately going to elevate the voices of our First Nations women and girls. And those recommendations are absolutely written in this report. Thanks, Aunt.
Thank you so much, Teela. Charlee-Sue, I'd love to ask you this question. You've been involved in this project since its inception. As an advisory committee member, really closely, I know you've been a participant in these consultations and an ongoing public supporter of the report too in its advocacy. How has it been to see the journey unfold, and how important is it for the work to continue?
Thanks, PK. And I just want to pay my acknowledgements to the other panel members. Such a privilege to be here with you all today. And I'm coming to you from the land of the Ngunnawal Ngambri people, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I also acknowledge my country. I'm a Nyamba woman from northwestern New South Wales, and I've got a number of matriarchs on the line from my family line, so I also want to acknowledge them. It was such a privilege to be involved in this work. There were so many members of our community who felt that they had been marginalised and silenced for such a long period of time. I'm not talking about through their life, I'm talking about the generations of family members before them who felt like they've never had a voice. So I think it's such a critical time that we have Commissioner June Oscar as the first Aboriginal Social Justice Commissioner. And I think leveraging her role and the opportunity that we have to really address the gender inequity and that exists within our community. I think to use her term in this as this was so important. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about what it was like being a part of the sessions. So I think the rooms that I was in the majority of New South Wales ones, and I think you walk away from those rooms and there was such a strength to be engaged in that process. So women were talking about really deep and challenging and difficult situations they face in their everyday life. And we saw in the animation today, elements of those being addressed in the animation. But I think what was really critical to remember is that this report was written quite intentionally as a strength-based report. And to start off those sessions, we had to talk about what made us strong as women, as First Nations women, and what made us strong as First Nations girls. And so many people were grounded in their own truths, in their own stories, in their own culture. They were grounded in place and community and within their family systems. And I think that's so important to talk about when we're talking about First Nations women, because we know exactly who we are. We know exactly where we belong, and there's such a critical, it's such a critical time for people to listen to us and really give rise to our voice and action our voice. This report, it was intended to be a living document. It was intended that it would never be shelved and people would continue to action this. And I think what we really need to be critical of, what is really critical with this report is that we cannot wait for another generation of our grannies or our great grannies, our future generations. We need to do this today. We can't wait for another generation. So I think it's also really important to remember when we're talking about gender justice. We've also got to remember that a lot of our communities, and I know Teela will agree with me on this, a lot of our communities were matriarchal communities, and we actually have to go back to our old ways and our old systems. We can't just accept that the patriarchy is the norm, and we've really got to think and consider what makes us culturally strong, what makes our communities strong. And a lot of that is reverting back to how do we provide space and opportunity for women, our First Nations women, to elevate their voices, and how do we support the younger generation to rise into this space also.
Thank you, Charlee-Sue. Look, I have a question for Fiona, and it's on some of the issues that you've already raised, but I want to sort of dig a bit deeper if we can. Healing is obviously such an important factor in moving towards embedding First Nations women and girls and delivering justice and equality in policy development. What role can the Healing Foundation play in that movement?
Yeah, look, we've been really busy. we speak to, in a lot of processes, what creates successful healing environments. And you'll note there's an adjective there Auntie June uses in the animation where the vision is we're intergenerationally healed. That's where the Healing Foundation comes in. We have the evidence and research to show it's possible now, and yes, long overdue. And the extensive dialogues and the voices you read in the report, it backs this. So when you back us as First Nations women, when you hear us, healing is possible. And I think what I'm proud of the most in leading this organisation is that it's our voices, but it's not our actions, because we do a lot. You've heard from the other panelists about that. This is about everyone else taking action and responding. And I mentioned that before, but the Healing Foundation has this evidence and research to support everybody else, to empower everybody else to respond and act. But it is led by our voices. So look, we need that system change, and sector by sector, workforce by workforce, we are working alongside boards and executive schools and a whole network of healing champions across nations to help them understand what their role must be, and to take on trauma-aware and healing-informed practice in all that they do. And this is action that's grounded in our strengths of our sisterhood, of survivor expertise, and of our cultural diversity and wealth. And look, what we're finding is that it's possible is often news to many. That it should happen takes some convincing. But you know, we're working on this. We've got reparations, redress, truth-telling up lately, but there's more to go, as you've heard from other panelists. But we're going to keep doing it because we know it's possible. We know it can happen. We know it's overdue. We know through our voices that great things are around the corner, and it's that better and best determined by our peoples that I was telling you about earlier.
Marcia Langton, I'd love to hear from you on what you think needs to happen now, what actions are needed to kind of embed the findings of a report like this in government policy. We heard Minister Ken Wyatt say that he would respond by the end of the year to this report, which I know would be something that June Oscar, who's been waiting for that, would welcome. What does that look like, though, in policy? What does the government need to do to embed that in its practice?
Well, I think some fast and urgent action is needed, Patricia. So June points out in the online introduction to the report that it's been 34 years since a report like this was published to Australians. And I was at the 1986 meeting. I was a part of that process. And that's how long we've waited, 34 years, for another report like this to elevate the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women. We made a lot of recommendations back in 1986. And as you can plainly see, we have been largely ignored. And in the meantime, as June and others have pointed out, the violence against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and children has escalated, and the Human Rights Commission itself has pointed out that we're now at the stage where the rates are so far in excess of those for other Australians. It might take decades to fix this problem, but we will lose too many lives if we have that attitude. So we need action now. So my strongest point to make here is that we need the National Summit of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women urgently. We need the National Advisory Body urgently, and we need to be part of the National Action Plan for safety for all Australian women. But we need our own report. We need to have a process whereby, just as in this process, the voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are heard and listened to. We have escalating incarceration rates of Indigenous women as well. And I think Teela raised that issue. This is another urgent problem, along with the rising rates of removal of children from their families. So I think these three issues, violence, incarceration and removal of children, necessitate urgent action. And I won't be alive in another 34 years. More than half my life has been spent waiting for some action on these issues. I don't want to wait anymore. Thank you.
Thanks, Marcia. And it makes me very emotional when you frame it that way, not only because I can't live without you, but I think that waiting and the fact that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders have been put in that position of waiting all the time, always waiting for a response when you provide the answers, must be incredibly difficult to constantly deal with. Teela, I want to put the same question to you, actually, that I put to Marcia in relation to action now, embedding it in government policy. What does that look like?
I think, Patricia, just, very briefly, the one thing that First Nations communities can't rely on is these cycles of political changes. We need some sustainability throughout, our lifetimes, as Marcia has said. That, I think, ultimately begins with ensuring that, the Uluru Statement from the Heart is upheld and implemented at the heart of our nation, a voice, and then treaties and truth-telling, to ensure that these changes that Aunt June has, recommended here are not reliant on the next politician or the next Minister of Indigenous Affairs, but at the heart and centre of First Nations policy is First Nations voices enshrined in that decision-making process. So I think that has to be the systemic change. And I think what we will witness then is ongoing improvements in the way in which policies are implemented, not just kind of recommended. So that's what I think.
Yeah, really well put. Charlee-Sue, what are your thoughts on what action looks like now and embedding these ideas in ongoing policy?
I think the report is written in such a way that the actions are already there. What is really needed is resources, the right support and the right mechanisms for women and girls to have their voices heard. I think once we put those in place, we need to allow governments, NGOs and other organisations and institutions that impose on our life every day to move aside so women and girls can actually make decisions about their own lives.
June Oscar, the woman who has driven this process, want to get you back in on this conversation, June. This is a really important moment for you and for your report and for potential action here. June, how do you want people to respond to not only the report, but also the animation and the work you're doing on this? And when I say people, I mean beyond just the Indigenous community. How do you think we need to respond to this?
Thank you, panel members, and thank you, Patricia. Look, I would want everyone, all First Nations women and girls, our men and boys, and all non-Indigenous peoples to treat this report and animation like it's yours, to own it. Wiyani Udangani is an incredibly generous invitation from First Nations women and girls right across Australia for all Australians to unite and come on the journey together to make First Nations gender justice and equality real for the benefit of everyone. This is not about a movement of exclusion or about one set of voices triumphing over others. This is about carving out the space for all First Nations women and girls to be heard in all of their strengths and power, because for too long, mainstream gender equality movements have marginalised our women. And although we have never been quite we are frequently silenced. But it is also about non-Indigenous women and men standing with us, being prepared to listen and learn. And I promise you, what will result will benefit us all, honestly. It is time to create the spaces for all of our voices and demonstrate our own capability, that we can see each other, that we can hear each other. And we and the animation can be used to change the narrative and begin a new conversation in some of these spaces. So, I'd encourage people to download the report, our community guide, and the many resources we have on our website. Read them and share them far and wide, and use the animation as the starting point to bring people together and have conversations, have courageous conversations, and plan the actions you will take. And as well as sharing the animation, you can host a screening of the animation, bring a panel of First Nations women together and use the leading discussion questions on our website to have the conversation. And let us know when you do it and what the outcomes are. And I want to hear your voices and know the influence you've made. I'm very interested and committed to that. So ultimately, I want all of you to share it in the dreams of our women and girls. Let the future we envision also be your future. And let's go on this journey together. That's what I want to see. I want this piece of work and the many thousands of voices of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and girls to live on and to inform others. And that is the legacy that we want to leave, and that we can build on that.
Powerfully articulated, June, and thank you to you for really being at the leadership level you are and pushing these very important issues. Thank you to all of my panel, indeed, for all of the powerful comments that have been made by these formidable women. And also just want to echo something that Teela said that meant quite a bit to me. It's important, I think, as we embrace this, particularly those of us who are non-Indigenous in this space, to sit in the discomfort that Teela talks about, and to know that that discomfort is actually part of the process, because acknowledging that discomfort is part of the healing, and not being afraid to acknowledge it, and listening, which is so key. I want to invite now the Human Rights Commission's President, Rosalind Croucher AO, to provide some concluding remarks.
Thank you, PK, for facilitating this wonderful discussion. I'm speaking from Gadigal land today, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and especially the women and girls, leaders now and in the future. And to the panel members, Commissioner June Oscar, Professor Marcia Langton, Fiona Cornforth, Teela Reid and Charlee-Sue Frail, thank you for sharing your work and talking about how we are collectively working towards the full realisation of the rights and aspirations of First Nations women and girls through gender justice and equality. I would also like to thank Minister Wyatt and Minister Payne, who were able to join us earlier, and to thank them for their time today. I know that many people have contributed to putting this event together. I would like to acknowledge and thank the social justice team, Nick Devereaux, Luani George, Jane Pedersen, Kimberly Hunter, Sophie Spry, Neve Keeley, Libby Gunn and Joe Tai. Your efforts to bring this all together have not gone unnoticed. Thank you once again. To our public engagement team of the Commission, thank you for all the media and comms you've provided for this event. And to our partners, Clara from the Documentary Australia Foundation, Steve, Vicky and Patrick from Social Deck, who hosted this event for us today, and the wonderful staff at Carbon Creative for putting together this amazing animation. Thank you all so very much. This has been such an amazing event, but this is also just the start of a movement towards ensuring First Nations women and girls' voices continue to be heard and valued. A conversation led and championed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner June Oscar AO. I know that so much of what was spoken about today is told through the collective voices of First Nations women and girls. And I wanted to acknowledge and thank the women and girls who shared so much of themselves to give light to the issues that have been presented today through the animation. The animation and discussion today has highlighted how the intersection of gender, class, race, indigeneity, and the unequal distribution of power, as well as the marginalisation of Indigenous knowledges, profoundly affects the lives of First Nations women and girls in very specific ways. As the President of the Australian Human Rights Commission, I am proud to support the work of the Wyatt report and to pay tribute to June Oscar and the role that June and the project has in ensuring rights of First Nations women and girls are heard by our leaders. As Commissioner Oscar said earlier, we need a national framework for action for First Nations gender justice and equality. If we do not see a commitment, we will see another landmark report, yes, landmark report, and this one specifically addressing the needs of First Nations women and girls, potentially ending up on the shelf. And at a moment in history when it is clear that we need to be implementing the solutions to address the needs of First Nations women and girls. As we've all heard throughout this conversation, Australia needs a national framework to address gender equality, and I consider that the message is clear. It should be spearheaded by First Nations women. The Wyatt website also has tools and resources available to help support First Nations gender justice and equality. In the coming weeks, the animation will be shown on NITV. I encourage you all to sign up to our newsletter and to join the discussions about how we can all work together. Thank you, Commissioner Oscar, for your great leadership as Social Justice Commissioner, for wedging the door wide open, as you said in your opening remarks, and for making the voices of the women and girls who put their trust in you loud and clear. Thank you, Patricia, for hosting the panel discussion, and thank you all for joining. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you, Patricia.
I will actually just say goodbye to everyone officially. Thank you to the Human Rights Commission President, Rosalind Croucher, for that important contribution there. Again, I want to thank Professor Marcia Langton. I want to thank June Oscar, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Justice Commissioner, Fiona Cornforth, Teela, Reid, Charlee-Sue, Frail, all of these powerful women who, I've got to say, there is no shortage of talent in this space for this advocacy. And thank you also to those who have joined. We have so many people, can I say, in this Zoom, which speaks volumes about, I think, the kind of real commitment in this country to these issues, right? Sometimes I don't think the political leadership does demonstrate just how much ordinary Australians are committed to changing this. And so I want to thank those, and I think it's really important that we move forward in this movement towards First Nations gender justice and equality for First Nations women and girls. And this report is incredibly powerful. Now, I know what I will be doing. I'll be speaking to June Oscar on television and radio later, talking about this again to the public. And I think all of us should be sharing this in all of the platforms we have and having those discussions, because change only happens if it happens from the bottom up. So that's our job. I will bid you all farewell.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, Roz. And thank the team This is such an exciting event. We've had over 2,000 plus registrations. I think the first time we've had such a large audience at a commission hosted event. So pretty awesome. Thank you all for joining and for your interest and support and love. Thank you.